In May of 1939, 5 countries sent delegates to London. They gathered inside BBC Broadcasting House for a single purpose. They were going to decide how every instrument on Earth gets tuned. The man who made the winning argument was not a musician. He was an electrical engineer who built his career in plastics. His name was Sir James Swinburne, and here was his case. 439 is a prime number, harder to reproduce electronically. 440 divides more cleanly for broadcast equipment. The room agreed and the resolution passed without dissent. 3 months later, the entire world was at war. And that single decision has shaped the sound of every song since. This is not a conspiracy theory about shadowy figures or hidden agendas. This is documented institutional history, available in public records. The May 1939 conference was organized by the British Standards Institute. Delegates came from France, Germany, the Netherlands, Italy, and England. Switzerland and the United States participated by mail. The proceedings are a matter of public record. The BSI published the results in December 1939 as British Standard Concert Pitch. What is not widely discussed is who was absent from that room. No composers, no professional performers, no acousticians working in the vocal or instrumental tradition. The people who made music were not consulted about how music should sound. The people who broadcast music made that decision for them. To understand what was lost, you have to understand what existed before. Before 1939, there was no universal tuning standard. Orchestras in Italy tuned differently from orchestras in Germany. A violin made in Paris and a violin made in Vienna might play the same note at slightly different frequencies. This sounds chaotic, but it was also organic. Local traditions shaped local sound. Instruments were built for the frequencies their makers preferred. And many of those makers across centuries and continents kept landing near the same number. 432. Not all of them, not precisely. Historical pitches varied widely. In some eras and regions, A ranged from 380 to 480 Hz. I need to be honest about that. No single frequency was universally adopted in the ancient world, but something interesting kept happening. Across cultures that had no contact with each other, a specific mathematical tradition kept surfacing, independently, repeatedly. In 1713, a French physicist named Joseph Sauveur proposed something elegant. He suggested setting middle C to 256 Hz. That number is 2 to the 8th power. And when you build a scale from that foundation, every octave of C becomes a whole number. C1 is 32, C2 is 64, C3 is 128, middle C is 256, C5 is 512. The entire system locks into binary mathematical order. When A is tuned to 432 within this framework, those relationships hold. At 440, they collapse. C becomes an irrational decimal. The binary architecture disappears. Sauveur was not a musician. He was a physicist. He was not arguing for beauty. He was arguing for mathematical coherence. And his framework was recognized for over 2 centuries as scientific pitch. Then came the wars over sound. Not metaphorical wars. Actual institutional battles fought in government chambers and international conferences. By the early 1800s, orchestras across Europe had begun competing with each other for brighter, more brilliant tone. The way to achieve it was simple. Tune higher. Tighten the strings. Push the pitch upward. This was wonderful for audiences. It was devastating for singers. Their vocal cords were being stretched beyond design limits. Careers shortened. Voices cracked and failed. Tenors lost their upper register decades early. Sopranos developed nodes and hemorrhages. The higher the orchestras tuned, the more singers suffered. And by mid-century, the singers fought back. They organized, they petitioned, they refused to perform. On February 16, 1859, the French government did something unprecedented. It passed a law about sound. A law setting A above middle, C to 435 Hz. This was the first government-mandated pitch standard in recorded history. It was called the diapason normal. The composers who advised the commission included Rossini, Meyerbeer, and Auber. The standard was adopted across much of Europe. For a brief window, the musical world had a shared reference point chosen by musicians, for musicians, to protect musicians. Then came Verdi. Giuseppe Verdi is not a minor footnote in this story. He was the most celebrated composer of his generation. The most performed opera composer in the world, his works filled theaters from Milan to New York. Heads of state attended his premieres. When Verdi spoke about music, governments listened, and in 1884 he wrote a letter to the Italian government's Music Commission. He asked them to lower the pitch further. He requested A at 432 Hz. His exact language referenced mathematical exigencies, not beauty, not taste, not preference, mathematics. He was making the same argument Sauveur had made in 1713, that certain frequencies align with mathematical structures that others do not, that this alignment is not arbitrary, that it matters. The Italian War Ministry agreed. They issued a formal decree establishing 432 throughout Italy, an official government standard backed by the most famous living composer on earth. Think about that. A law about sound, passed because the greatest musician alive asked for it, grounded in mathematical reasoning that stretched back 2 centuries. It lasted 1 year. In 1885, a conference in Vienna, dominated by British delegates, rejected Italy's standard. No Italian composers were given a meaningful platform. The decree was abandoned. Verdi's frequency was backed by government law. It was backed by 2 centuries of mathematical research. It was backed by the explicit support of 23,000 French musicians who had signed a petition organized by Professor Dussault of the Paris Conservatory. And it was overruled. The people who understood sound lost. The people who managed standards won. And with that defeat, the last institutional effort to anchor music to the mathematical framework that Sauveur and Verdi had identified as natural was extinguished. The frequency that made the mathematics whole was overruled by the frequency that was easier to broadcast. Though broadcasting itself would not arrive for decades, the decision anticipated a technology that did not yet exist. Now, the fair objection. Reasonable people will point out that pitch has always varied. There was never a single, natural tuning used universally across all cultures, that is true. Historical tuning ranged wildly. Some church organs in Germany were tuned above 500 Hz. Some Baroque ensembles played below 400. The idea that 432 is some cosmic frequency embedded in the universe is, frankly, overstated. And 440 has real practical benefits. It is easy to generate electronically, it divides cleanly, it simplifies calibration. These are not trivial considerations in a world that needed standardized broadcast. I do not dismiss this. But there is a difference between acknowledging that standardization was useful and accepting that the specific frequency chosen was irrelevant, that the process by which it was chosen does not matter, that the people excluded from the decision had nothing to contribute, because here is what the body knows, even when the institution denies it. In 2019, researchers Calamasi and Pomponi published a double-blind crossover pilot study in the journal Explore. 33 volunteers listened to the same music on different days. On one day, the music was tuned to 440. On the other, 432. The subjects did not know which version they were hearing. This matters. Neither the subjects nor the researchers administering the listening sessions knew which frequency was playing. The design was rigorous, and the results were specific. Heart rate dropped by nearly 5 beats per minute under 432 Hz. Blood pressure trended lower, respiratory rate decreased. Subjects reported greater focus and higher satisfaction with the 432 sessions, 5 beats per minute. That is not subtle. That is a measurable shift in autonomic nervous system response from a frequency difference of just 8 Hz. In 2022, an EEG study of 74 participants measured brain activity directly. Listeners showed stronger alpha wave activity in the left prefrontal cortex during 432 Hz exposure. Alpha waves are associated with relaxed awareness and emotional acceptance. The differences were modest. The researchers were careful to note that. But they were measurable, reproducible, documented in peer-reviewed literature, and entirely ignored by the institutions that set the standard. Think about the scale of that exposure. Every song recorded since the mid-20th century, every film score, every advertisement jingle, every church hymn played through a speaker system, every piece of hold music, every ringtone, every national anthem broadcast on television, every lullaby played from a streaming service to a sleeping infant, all tuned to 440. From birth to death, you have been bathed in a frequency chosen for broadcast convenience. It was not selected for how it affects the human body. It was selected for how efficiently it could be reproduced by equipment. A frequency whose measurable physiological effects include slightly elevated heart rate and slightly increased autonomic agitation compared to the alternative. Effects that are small per listening session. But sessions never stop. The exposure is lifelong. It begins before you can speak and does not end until you do. I sat with this research for weeks before I could write about it. Not because the evidence is unclear, the evidence is straightforward. Dates, names, institutional records, peer-reviewed studies. The difficulty is context. The difficulty is that the conspiracy crowd has poisoned the well so thoroughly that asking legitimate questions about this topic marks you as unserious. They claim the Nazis weaponized 440 Hz, that Joseph Goebbels personally orchestrated the 1939 conference, that the Rockefeller Foundation conspired to change the frequency of music to control populations. None of that is supported by credible documentation. 440 Hz was proposed as early as 1834 by Johann Scheibler at the Stuttgart Conference. The American music industry adopted it informally by the 1920s. Goebbels did not invent it. But the conspiracy narrative has made the real story easier to dismiss. And the real story is damning enough on its own. You do not need shadowy figures to explain what happened. You need only to recognize that engineers made a decision that belonged to musicians. That mathematical elegance was sacrificed for broadcast convenience. That the human body's response to sound was never part of the equation. The instruments themselves carry the evidence. Consider a Stradivarius violin, built in Cremona in the early 1700s, carved by hand. Every curve, every thickness of wood, every dimension of its resonant chamber was designed for a world that tuned below 440. Baroque pitch was typically around 415. French physicist Félix Sauveur, working with the renowned instrument maker Jean-Baptiste Vuillaume, measured the resonant frequency of Stradivarius soundboards at 512 Hz. In Pythagorean tuning, that corresponds to a C built for A at 432. When modern musicians force these instruments to 440, they are pushing wood and varnish and resonant architecture beyond its intended design. Luthiers have noted this quietly for decades. Some have said so in trade publications. The wood resists. The resonant chambers were carved for different mathematics. The instrument remembers what the industry decided to forget. And that word, decided, is the one that matters. This was not inevitable. It was not a natural evolution of musical practice. It was not the logical conclusion of centuries of refinement. It was a decision made in a room by people with specific priorities at a specific moment in history. A decision that excluded the people most qualified to make it. A decision that overrode 2 centuries of mathematical research and the explicit advocacy of the most famous composer of the 19th century. A decision that, once made, was ratified by international standards, bodies in 1953 and again in 1975, each time without meaningful input from performing musicians. The sound was locked in, globally, permanently, and no one has unlocked it since. What does music sound like at the frequency the old instruments were built for? What happens in the body when middle C is 256 Hz? When it is a perfect power of 2 instead of the irrational fragment it becomes at 440? Why did the international community adopt a standard without consulting a single composer? Why was Verdi overruled? Why were the musicians who objected simply ignored, their petitions filed away, their concerns dismissed as sentimental? Every lullaby your mother hummed along to, every anthem played at a ceremony you attended, every piece of music that moved you to tears or made your pulse quicken, all of it was tuned to a frequency chosen by an engineer who built plastics, because it was convenient for radio equipment, not because it was right for the human ear, not because it was right for the human heart, not because anyone asked how sound makes a body feel. Your ears have never heard the version of music the instruments were built for. Neither have mine. Neither has anyone born after the middle of the last century. We inherited a sound we did not choose from a room we were never invited into, and we have been told it does not matter. But the body keeps score. The heart rate data says otherwise. The brainwaves say otherwise. The wood of a 300-year-old violin, still straining against its modern tuning, says otherwise. And the letter from Verdi, written in 1884 with the careful frustration of a man who understood exactly what was being lost, says otherwise. Somewhere in the mathematics that Sauveur mapped and Verdi fought for, there is a version of music we have never been allowed to hear, a frequency the instruments remember, a resonance the body recognizes, a sound that was measured, documented, defended by the greatest composer of his century, and encoded in government decree, then quietly replaced by a room full of engineers who decided that convenience mattered more than what music does to a living human being. The standard still holds. No institution has revisited it. No serious effort has been made to ask whether the original decision was correct. Every attempt has been dismissed as pseudoscience, despite the peer-reviewed data suggesting otherwise. The frequency holds. The question holds too. If the difference truly does not matter, why was it so important to standardize it globally? Why enforce it permanently? And why make certain that no one who actually made music had a voice in the decision?